They're gonna catch me checklist. That's a bad bet.
Welcome back to Never Fade, the NFT podcast. I'm your host, FaXx, and we have a very special episode lined up for you today. Last week, we had Shrimpto, the largest holder of visualized value checks by Jack Butcher, and he dropped the alpha. But one person that wasn't there to hear the alpha was my co host, Goodmonth ETH. Goodmonth, where were you last week? Did you listen to the Shrimpto episodes? Any takeaways?
Yeah, I listened in. I had to be off cam because I was ready to just slurp up any alpha that came through. So I had to be on the boards.
Yeah, buddy. Did you catch some alpha or what?
I mean, did I think O'Peppin caught a body? So that might be what we're talking about here on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Shrimptail was like, watch out for O'Peppin. I checked the floor, it was like 0.09. 4 days later, ripped up to zero point 0.9, and it's pulled back. Pretty interesting phenomenon. I think you guys know the story. Never Fade, the NFT podcast. And in addition, we have our other co-host here, Mitch Morales. Mitch has been with us through the journey of checks as we've investigated the whole ecosystem here, wire to wire. And we wanted to make sure our check expert, our resident check expert, was in the house today. What's up, Mitch?
Hey guys, yeah, excited to talk to the man, the legend himself, Jack. Since we talked last, yeah, uh, the O'Peppin pump, if you will. Seeing that metadata change, it's got me waking up like Christmas morning, seeing what's new.
Well, I'll tell you what's under the Christmas tree this morning for you, Mitch. An interview with Jack Butcher himself, the hottest man in the NFT space. Absolutely going viral.
Hold up, FaXx. FaXx, did you just put Jack Butcher on GQ? Did you just give him the looks of the year right there, calling the hottest man in space? Is that what this pod's about?
Absolutely, absolutely. No questions asked. Just step next to Jack and get incinerated by the heat, man. In all angles, this guy's hitting it. He's hitting it with the art. He's hitting it with the tweets. He's hitting it with the hype. He's got his education. He's got his classes. He's got the branding. He's got the total package, and we're bringing them to you direct on the Never Fade podcast this morning.
I want to hear from you, FaXx. I want to hear from you, like your journey into checks, because you went. I think it's probably been 3 weeks. 3 weeks since you went from I don't get it to I'm wearing the sweatshirt. So I need to hear about the trials and tribulations of that.
Yeah, that's fair. Actually, this goes all the way back to 2021 when people were trading squiggles. They were trading
so a decade ago, to be clear.
Yeah.
A decade
what did I say?
ago.
2021.
Yeah.
No, but that's how long it feels like.
It's
yeah.
good.
Yeah. In the NFT space, it's a decade for real. But look, the reality is there were squiggles trading, and dude, I didn't get it, man. Like I was just like, I don't understand. Like I was pretty new to NFTs. I came in through like the Top Shot route. It made sense. Like, okay, basketball cards, you collect cards. I collected cards when I was little. Now we're doing it on the blockchain. It makes sense. The monkeys, that's when I was like, all right, these apes is kind of funny. Oh, this is a vibe. But like some of the other like art, I didn't understand, and it took me a while. And by the time I did understand, it was like 20 ETH. And I was like, okay, well, this is hard to approach now. But the big takeaway that I had from that experience was like, you may not understand at first, but it's on you to put the effort to understand, So when the checks came out, I saw them on the timeline. Mitch, shared actually the day that they were minting. He shared that open edition link, and I was busy. I got stuff to do. I was like, okay, cool. I'll take a look later. By the time I did take a look, they were trading at like 0.2, and I was like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. I'll watch this. And then next thing I know, they're 3x to 0.6 ETH floor. And then I'm like, okay, guys, what are we doing here? What are these checks about? Who is Jack Butcher? Like, unpack this for me. And by the time you guys were done talking, I had like sniped a couple checks, just put them in the bag. Long story short, I'm sitting on just a couple of checks. I got one unrevealed check, and I have this one that I minted on day one, which is a linear Z 20 band, straight grail. Like, it's beautiful. It's my GN every morning. I'm like, good morning with the sunshine checks and good night with the blue dark checks. So it's a vibe. I'm feeling it. I got the hoodie. I like to get full immersed into the game. That's my story. And I
Hey,
will
if at
say,
first you don't believe, buy a bag up and buy again. That's what you did. That's what you did there, boy.
yeah, that's it. I mean, I just, sometimes you gotta like get a little alpha from your friends. That's part of the deal out here, and that's what happened. And yeah, the cool thing about the unrevealed checks is it's like a canvas for Jack to have commentary on what's going on. So, like, for example, when Facebook announced that they were gonna have this like paid verification and use the check following Twitter's footsteps there, he made a play on that, and he put up the F for Facebook check. And so it's like this interaction with the artist where they're dropping alpha in terms of their art straight into your wallet. And it's a pretty cool concept, and the way he's doing it and executing it is awesome. So I'm thinking, just like, hold that unrevealed check and be part of the Jack Butcher living art experience.
Yeah, 100p. I think what's kind of interesting is like he updates the metadata, and then it's almost like I don't know about y'all. Do you guys go to OpenSea or to your marketplace to like check that metadata? Do you go to your wallet to see if it's updated? Like, what is your step process there when he updates the metadata? What do you do?
First of all, I usually see it on Twitter first, because he
Yeah.
usually tweets it out. Yeah, and then I just go to OpenSea and I check it out and I see what's cracking there.
Yeah. And we're not gonna talk about too much like trading volume on this with Jack. So just a little moment in time update. We got the VV Editions, which are the ones that are yet to be burned. They're all agnostically the same except for serial numbers at a 2.4 ETH floor. We got the originals, which is what happens after the new mint and the editions get burned, at a 1.43. They were down to 1.2 earlier this morning, so they bounced back a bit. And then you got the Opepins sitting at 0.73, and they added a percent of unique owners overnight, which was something I was, there's 34% unique owners on the editions. There was 32% on Opepins. So I've been kind of waiting for that percentage point to tick up, and we're there. And it's funny, man. I started realizing just 2 days ago, people in chats are starting to talk about vaulting checks. This is exactly how the Squiggles art box thing went down. People are having fun. It's goofy. They're finding things they like. They're finding pieces they jive with. It's becoming a part of their digital identity and map and holdings and whatnot. And then they just start vaulting 1, vaulting 2, sliding them in, going cold, storage with it. So, I mean, I don't know. Also, I think, we talked about it internally in the stand-up right after Superburn, and checks were down at like the 0.8 range. Kind of thought bottom was in. They ended up going to like 0.69 and haven't looked back.
We got Jack Butcher in the studio. Jack, you're absolutely lighting up the NFT space, the darling of Web3. How are you doing, my guy? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good, boys. Thanks for having me.
So we really want to kind of like step outside of checks and OPEPin for a minute here and understand better the whole platform that is Visualize Value. So if you could kind of walk us through a little bit of a brief history on Visualize Value and what it is and what motivated you to start it.
Yeah, so I try and do the TLDR. So I studied graphic design back in the UK at university, graduated in 2010, and came straight out of design school and just started working unpaid internships in little design studios in London. And real weird chain of events led me to New York Met a couple dudes in a pub who had a friend who could get cheap flights to New York. I was like, yeah, count me in, I'll come. I Googled graphic design internships in New York. Craigslist was the first result. I sent 150 emails to every single job posting on Craigslist of design internships in New York. Got one response and ended up getting sponsored through that guy, stayed in New York for about 10 years after the fact, just bouncing around a bunch of different agency jobs. So that first place was like a little boutique design agency. Would do like TV commercials, print ads, retail, branding type stuff. And then just bounced around all different creative shops of different shapes and sizes. So little boutique agency, like Big Four consulting type thing, startups, a couple experiential agencies would do like retail installations, museum installations, just like every kind of commercial application of graphic design that there is. I kind of had exposure to a bunch of different things through those 10 years of bouncing around. And then in probably late 2017, I think. So I'm getting my timeline a little bit muddled here. So I was working about 7 or 8 years in those jobs, and then decided, I'm going to start my own agency. And that was basically a function of getting to a stage in my career where I was exposed to the economics of the agency business. So it's like, here's how much we're charging client X for this email template. I'm looking at that. I'm like, whoa, that is insane. I'm getting paid this and you're charging that. It was completely like arrogant, naive take on it, because obviously there's a bunch of infrastructure that made that happen. I was like, oh, I'll just go and do this by myself. So anyway, I spun up my own agency. It was called Opponent originally, and got a few clients through my old contacts and old agency days. They were all like big corporate clients, and then almost instantly realized this is not what I want to do. I was just like answering phones all day in meetings, having to hire people, having like, you have to get a certain type of office if you want these people to come visit you when you're doing your work, all that stuff. So that didn't really work out. Learned a lot doing it. And I was like, okay, still want to be in the design business, still love solving problems visually, all of those things. And Visualize Value kind of came out of those realizations, a couple different iterations of the business, which basically ended up as like visualizing value as a service for people. So anybody had a product or a service or an idea that was really difficult to explain verbally, I would sit down with them for a couple hours and be like, how about, here's 5 slides to introduce the concept that you're trying to communicate and unpack how your product works, blah, blah, blah. So basically pitch decks as a service was what Visualize Value began as. And the content was really a lead generation thing for the service. So I started posting on Instagram and Twitter to get clients for the one-on-one service work where I would sit down and, make these pitch decks. And that stuff was pretty unglamorous to begin with, right? It's like logistics companies that are trying to explain how they're more efficient at storing pallets than, whatever incumbent or software companies. So it's pretty unsexy work, but I had like scratched the creative itch by doing the content on the front end, which was like books that I love reading, authors that had written about ideas that had really influenced me. And that was really the feedback loop that started the product business. So eventually that generated enough momentum where I couldn't fulfill all of the demand for the service work. So I was like, let me create a couple of education products. So made a design program. And then after that made a kind of meta layer on top of that, which is like, if you find yourself in the position I'm in where you're running this service business and you feel like completely burned out and you have all of this experience, why not package it into something that can replicate infinitely and free up some of your time? And then this is probably going beyond the scope of the question, but that's like in the last couple of years, NFTs and crypto, just as a function of how complicated it is, has always been how complicated it is from the outside, has always been like a really amazing subject matter for applying what Visualize Value is.
Yeah, and Jack, I wanted to follow on to that. We all have our own, origin stories in crypto / Web3. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that, maybe that first aha moment, that first time of you went down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, sure. So It's actually my first time crypto. These are two different moments entirely. Bitcoin was my first, Bitcoin white paper, same story as most people. Someone I work with put me onto it, 2017, as a function of it going parabolic. I read up into it. I'm like, this is amazing. What, like a, paradigm shifting idea. Price goes absolutely, south. And not that I lost interest in it, but I was still in my agency job back then. I was like, all right, back to work. Maybe, this will come back around in a few years. And that's like, after that happened, that was kind of intersected when I started visualized value business and all that stuff. So it's probably a good thing that I wasn't distracted by it for a few years. And then basically, as a function of starting visualized value, starting these education products, I grew this network of people that were trying to start digital businesses or trying to like better communicate what they did on the internet. So I had this Discord server of all the people taking the visualized value courses. And there's a couple people reached out to me probably late 2020. Like, you should be looking into NFTs. This is like perfect synergy with what you're doing, right? You make digital art, you should look into this. And I think they put me onto OpenSea back then. This is when CryptoPunks were $5. And I looked at OpenSea. I'm like, this is horrible. I don't want to put my work on here. Like, no offense to OpenSea at that time, right? But it was just like an aggregator of stuff. It was like a digital eBay type vibe. And I was like, this doesn't feel like, even Instagram is way more curated, and it feels like you're presenting your work in a way that, it's crafted and you care about it. So I was like, oh, that's cool. That's interesting, but I'm not putting my work on there. And it wasn't until probably February or March, like a few months later, where, early 2021, this is when it was obviously going insane. So it was all over my radar at that point. But then Foundation was an invite only one-of-one platform at that point. And I saw that and then it clicked. I was like, oh, now I get it, right? This is a place to present and sell digital artwork that has been like beautifully crafted. The curation element is there. Everything felt like, a premium auction house for art in the real world. This is like the equivalent coming to life in real time. So that was the real, I guess, the moment where it clicked how I could get involved in it. And then just as a function of starting to sell work that way, all of the other aspects of the technology, the community of people involved in it, and like the possibilities of it just kind of unfolded from that point.
Yeah. And at that time that you popped into OpenSea back in that November of 2020 time, there was probably like 3 collections. It was probably like Crypto Kitties, Clovers. Do you remember the Clover collection that you probably
I've seen it. Yeah.
stumbled
I wouldn't
on?
know anything about it, but I have seen it.
Yeah, that's funny because there's, very little collections at that point. So Foundation, when you popped onto that in about March 21, this was also the point where artists started kind of collecting this digital coin, and they started being collectors of other artists. So did you meet other artists through transacting art and sharing art at that point?
Yeah, 100%. So obviously the early artists on Foundation, I met a bunch of people digitally that way. And then the kind of collectible scene came as a secondary function of that. So I think the combination of experience in building visualized value, where you have like, you're building distribution and you see how like these ideas can disseminate at scale on the internet. That's the point when the collectible thing really clicked for me. Like the network effect of art, like connected art, is very different than one-of-one art. So that was another like evolution in my understanding of this entire world.
Yeah. Amazing. So now flash forward to where we are now, January 23. Y'all have been working you've been working in black and white with visualized value for all this time. And now enters checks, now enters color. Like, walk us through that a little bit. But by working in the black and white world and now going into color, is this something that you've always wanted to do? Is it a new experience for you? Do you have a backlog of colored items that you've been just kind of thinking and stemming on up until this point?
Yeah, so great question. The black and white thing for visualized value was, I'm not going to say it was accidental, but it was definitely like a conscious decision early on to add a restriction that made it easier to put work out consistently. So instead of staring at a blank page every time, you're like, here's an idea that I want to convey. What typeface am I going to use? What color palette am I going to use? What like set of symbols am I going to use? Am I going to use photography? Am I going to do, it was like, I've been in the branding marketing world for so long. The idea of brand guidelines where it's like, this is what you use, this has to be this far away from the edge. You use this typeface. These are the only shapes that are allowed to be involved in any composition. So it's kind of accidentally came about from that. And then I retroactively saw this quote. I think it was Tim Ferriss that said this. He said, make one decision to eliminate 1,000 decisions. And I've always used that basically to refer to that constraint. So it's like, these are the restrictions. And what that does for the process of being consistent is it forces you to basically communicate the idea better versus spending all this time laboring over aesthetic nuance, which there is value in that, of course. But for my skill set, making that decision really helped me just produce at scale. And then the color thing, I think there was a couple pieces, even not like earlier in the NFT world, where the color just became this thing that really stood out. So it was just like another way to emphasize a point. So as soon as I introduce a tiny bit of color, there's like a shock value to that based on the fact that everything else is black and white. And I think the first piece of color I introduced was a blue check mark back in March 2021, which is kind of a, ironic first like genesis of this journey. And then that, I guess going like full spectrum color as a like an addendum to that, or like revisiting that 2 years later with full spectrum color it actually made the process much harder for me because I don't work in color that often, and like going in and honing all of these complementary colors, RGB gradients, like making sure stuff works smoothly across all of these different compositions was a fun creative challenge and totally different. But also, I guess the symbol becomes the restraint and then the color is unlocked so it's kind of the same idea, just flipped a little bit, where in the original visualized value compositions, you can use any symbol, but no color. And in this, you can use any color, but only one symbol. So it's been a cool, it's kind of the same set of rules, just flipped on its head.
It's fascinating. And I don't think a lot of people have fully understood that colors are variables. I mean, that from what you just described, it just sounds like entering color is adding a new variable to a matrix, which opens up a whole new world. And I mean, it's great. It's great to see. I think that's something that people will be really stoked to think and hear about. It's like colors, we see color all the time in the NFT space. But you are delivering on color for in kind of a rare occasion. I think that's something people will be excited to take note to after hearing this. But
yeah, I appreciate it. It's a good question. I need to think more about it too. It's definitely been like creatively satisfying for sure.
Nice. I'm glad to hear. It's a great question. We had some internal debate here on the team, actually. FaXx was like thinking about ripping the question out. So I'll take the validation.
I was like, here. Wait, what are you going to ask him? Does he like working with colors? Like, what are you going to say? And he's like, no, man, he's a designer.
Huge philosophical debate.
Yeah, so I'm going to hear about this after. So we lost Mitch for a second there. He's back. Mitch, are you with us? Are you with us, Mitch?
My phone, Riverside shut my phone down. I'm getting rugged. So taking it back to checks for a second, we are a couple weeks past Super Burn Sunday, and leading up to that moment, we saw VVD come out with his little iteration on the project. And on a day of the Super Bowl where so many eyes are on the advertising world, you happen to have a billboard of 16,000 LED screens where you can put any image up. Were you kind of were you ever second guessing doing the burn that day because you had kind of this collective attention on the project?
Yeah, it's a good, I think one of the things long term that's powerful about it is it anchors it against this really massive milestone. So like a year out from now, anybody involved in this that is, tangentially hears of the Super Bowl, it's like, oh, Checks launched a year ago, 2 years out, 2 years ago, 3 years out. So we track to that milestone. So that was one of the reasons. The attention thing was definitely a consideration, but it's also the amount of people on Twitter that day doing second screen experience is also massive. So there's a consideration in like maybe people aren't on their computer, maybe people aren't doing X, Y, or Z. But I think obviously the pun Super Burn Sunday played into it too. So deciding based on a couple of different factors, and it went way more. Like the participation on day one was just insane, way beyond what I imagined it was going to be, and that ran over into the Monday as well. And I think maybe that countdown to something parallel that people are already looking forward to watching was helpful too. So there's a couple other countdowns happening in the NFT world, like the day before or day after. And I know you kind of borrow some of that momentum from this massive cultural event. I think it translated. We were like super happy with how many people participated, given the fact, this massive thing was going on at the same time. It was also a 24-hour window, right? So you could do it before, after, the next morning. So overall, I think good decision.
You've been kind of running this as sprints, as I've been looking at it. Like you kind of had the post mint sprint to figure out, ideate and iterate in public. What are we going to do with this thing? And then you kind of decide burn mechanism and design. So you kind of have like a couple of engineering and product sprints after that. Have there been any things that have happened where you kind of didn't get the expected result so far, a month and a half into the project?
So there's definitely been, I don't think so, not on the engineering side at least, and that has been basically a function of being transparent or trying to do it publicly, where there were things that we were gonna launch that we spoke about before that people would DM and be like, hey, that's like, there's a vulnerability in this, or you need to consider X, Y, or Z. So like there were definitely responses that we didn't anticipate, but the results of like building the things that had been vetted in public turned into very predictable outcomes, which is, I think there's just a interesting lesson there in, being completely upfront about what it is you're going to build before you build it. And then there's obviously execution risk in that, and you have to execute on the thing that you said you're going to do. But because it had been announced and, the people paying attention to this have experience in this world, we caught a few things along the journey. Like there's a thread that Jalil did about a reveal mechanism he worked on with Mouse Dev. And that, honestly, if we hadn't have posted about that in advance, this thing could have been like gamed and could have potentially destroyed the trust in the project. Like the ability for people to go in and game the reveal system would have sucked. But that was probably the biggest one in the whole process.
This was the block confirmation submittal. That post merge, basically, you can submit a full block. That was going to front run the amazing rarity reveal that you guys had set up. So putting that, I think what you're saying is putting that thread out there allowed somebody to responsibly disclose to you about a way this could actually be defeated. And then Mouse Dev, I think, implemented that fix to prevent that block confirmation submittal. Is that correct? Is that what you're referring to?
That's exactly right. So there's they call it an epoch reveal. So basically the reveal of the additions when you migrate them is dependent on block data from the future. So nobody can game that out because it's doesn't exist yet, that data.
Right.
Yeah, the technical nuance of that is lost on me. So you have to go and read that thread if you're like into the absolute nuance of it. But massive shout out to those guys. They're just geniuses.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm from the cybersecurity world prior to going full-time Web3. So when I caught that you were doing this reveal time in the future, I really think it's lost on a lot of people the technical prowess that got put into this rarity reveal mechanism. And eventually, as we at Goodmonth Labs work with brands, like we're going to be recommending reveal mechanisms like this moving forward, because you defeat a lot of things that are problems. And I think one thing that a lot of people, and I don't know if you've been told this by Mouse Dev or you've known this yourself, but Vitalik from Ethereum has spent years writing on randomness and writing on that problem specifically. So the fact that you and the team whipped up something that takes into account futuristic and deterministic things on Ethereum, I mean, it's actually a pretty big technical milestone. So, I mean, congrats on that. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Full credit to those guys and full credit to, I think his name's MEV Tiger, the guy that called it out.
Nice.
That led to the fix, which is awesome. And I was going to say one other thing. Yeah, like the other alternatives to that problem would have been like massively deterministic on how this thing played out. And it also led to this idea that after these things have been migrated, the family tree is deterministic, which I think is another different and interesting thing that gives collectors true agency over the process versus just introducing this random component over and over and over again. So yeah, it's like finding that out by discussing this in public led us to what I think is a way more sophisticated solution all around.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's flash forward a little bit. Checks explode. They go wild. The speculators they're here, right? They're around. We won't spend too much time talking about that, but you're building, the vision is evolving. And just recently you threw out the tweet, OPEPFP. What can you tell us about your interpretation of the impact of that tweet?
So the impact, obviously, people love that acronym PFP, right? In this world, that's like the meta on which a lot of this space has been at least popularized. I wouldn't necessarily say built on, but there are obviously a lot of very notable PFP projects, but in terms of like amount of energy that goes into creating that specific category is probably 95%, maybe more. So I think the impact of it has to do with the anticipation of starting to use that vehicle for the art, right? The beachfront property of digital real estate is something I tweeted out the other day, which I think is a fair way to characterize the PFP. It's in you don't even have to visit somebody's notifications, right? It's in whenever they reply to someone, it's in your notifications tab. Sorry, I should say you don't have to visit someone's profile to see their PFP. So
yeah,
I have a lot of things I could say about that entire world, and there'll probably be a whole nother episode, but I worked on something actually with Jalil Traff and a guy called Aaron Alto last year, a collection that we were going to put out. It just never really felt like something that we wanted to do. Not that it wasn't artful and great and we weren't proud of it, but it just felt like it didn't really have the philosophical fortitude or the perspective, like in the same way that Checks has an idea like twisted up in it and is trying to explore something and ask questions. It was more of a like, we can make some beautiful art that follows this thing that the market seems to enjoy, right? That's a very different exercise. And yeah, I think being able to, well, the challenge for me now, I think, is to like artfully leverage that format to help like get more eyeballs on Checks as a project. That's essentially the goal.
Yeah, and if I'm interpreting your thread about it right, it kind of sounds like, checks is that base level, that atomic level of the ecosystem. Maybe that's too bold of a word. But it's that atomic level of an ecosystem, and its inherent trait is mimetic.
Yeah, I think, it's a great observation. I think we're trying to basically make the atomic level can also represent the technology itself, right? It's like these things have been abstracted away from each other. It's like, here's this artwork that happens to be on Ethereum, right? It's done very well because it's on Ethereum and that's a busy network, but it doesn't need to be on Ethereum to function. And it doesn't necessarily express the qualities of Ethereum or this idea of decentralized verification of a ledger, of a sequence of numbers, of whatever synonyms you want to use to describe a blockchain in its like widest sense. But that idea of check as something that we want to get people to think about, not only like just the basic, like check what you're signing. Like if you're gonna take the responsibility to have like economic energy on your computer, then you have to be very vigilant about how you store it, how you interact with things, etc. But also introducing people. A lot of people talk about onboarding, right? We want to onboard 1 billion people to this thing, and in many ways, like this behavior is inevitable. It's just the way it comes about. And I love all of the writing that 6529 has done about this idea of freedom to transact, an open metaverse, and ultimately the bridge into all of those things is going to be mimetic in some sense. It might be like, hey, you like this character and you buy this thing. I just think that is you're less likely to come into this ecosystem understanding what it's really about if that's your only context. And if the projects building those things don't do anything other than, tweet once a month about not like following fake Twitter accounts, that's not really unpacking the depth that there is to be explored here. And I'm super lucky to work with Jalil specifically, who shares a lot of these ideas and wants to, like, being able to use a project like this as kind of a wrapper for everything that is happening underneath is really like something that has been incredibly rewarding. And there's a lot more potential beyond what we've deployed already, right? There's just other ways to comment on this thing, and that tweet is kind of a sub project of this idea of checks, basically.
Yeah. And we'll pass it over to FaXx here. I know he's got a line of questions for you, but one, just a quick tidbit is, I was just reading on Twitter, you might find it interesting, is there's some people who are in the Western Hemisphere that are dropping into Eastern Hemisphere Discord servers, can't understand an ounce of the language that's going on in it, but they're vibing as a community in Discord around the memes, around the images, with totally missing on written text, and it's fascinating. I think it just kind of speaks to the core of the project. So I'll pass it over to FaXx here for the questions.
That's awesome.
Love the convo. Put these two guys in a room and just put on your headphones and listen in. Man, that's what I'm talking about. Jack, the way that you're using the additions and now the Opepins as kind of like a living canvas is something super interesting. It's like you have these 16,000 billboards inside of users' wallets. And so, when we think about the checks, we have people, of course, minting the originals, burning the checks. But for myself, like, the addition that is unrevealed, like, to me is like, man, I don't want to tamper with this, because this is like the perpetual direct channel to Jack's art. Can you talk a little bit about that construct? Because I haven't seen anybody execute this idea the way that you have.
Yeah, I think something like one statistic, I guess, that I would tee this up with for context is that initial open edition mint was minted, I think, 15 or 16 times more than the image was liked on Twitter, which is a fascinating departure in, I think, what most people would imagine to be the case, right? You would imagine that a piece of art gets 100 likes on Twitter, maybe 2 people mint it. And that's another hat tip to the network effects of Ethereum. And for whatever reason, obviously there are people who appreciate the thing in there, and there are people who are just speculating on other people appreciating the thing. But for the most part, that establishes this amazing network effect between you and people that care about your art, the things you have to say, the things that you're producing, in a way that is very different than posting something on Twitter or Instagram. Like, you have that connection there, but you have the mediation of the algorithm between you and the person. So if you tweet something that, say, I would imagine you've seen every update of the metadata of checks, if not 90%, right? Versus seeing everything someone communicates on a platform that isn't, like, the distribution is not in their control. So just fundamentally, I think that's different. It's like this agreement, this connection is so much more significant. And that's true of free mints. That's not talking about money being exchanged. It's just it's a peer-to-peer connection. That's what crypto is, right? It's the ability to move value from one place to another without something in the middle. And I think that's also true. If you take NFTs, that's basically, for the communication layer of crypto, that's true. So obviously, like, being able to send money from here to somebody who is unbanked in whatever part of the world where there isn't banking infrastructure, or they just don't have access to it, is the same as being able to broadcast a message from here to anywhere else in the world. So that fundamental difference, I think, is something that we're trying to playfully reveal as well. As, like, you could go the route that I think a lot of people try to go, and it's like, this is about, 6529 does a good job about this. It's like transmitting these ideas with NFTs as a canvas, but what the metadata thing does in a single collection is there's just like equity built up in that story, because you're changing the image on this thing that had previously changed. It's like the next chapter in the thing, as opposed to establishing a new channel of communication and then making people have to pay attention to that thing. So in the same way, like, visualized value became this constraint, I think a lot of those lessons have carried into this collection, where it's like that single canvas becomes the constraint, and every little iteration you do on top of it hopefully just get somebody more interested in the story, or like more like exposed to the totality of the story. And there's a lot of people write suggestions like, oh, you could rent this out, or do, and I think we'll see that use case, right? Like, it's an amazing way for brands to get distribution, for example. But it's also an amazing canvas for an artist, that if your canvas is the internet, the speed at which culture moves on the internet, et cetera, some people are able to make art that, transcends trends and just, is able to remain relevant all time. And those are like, power law, the royalty of power laws is like the 0.01% puts artwork out there and it lasts forever. But knowing how difficult it is to keep attention on the internet, I feel like we're going to see a lot more of this evolving communication in a single connection, versus like diluting the connection every time, right? But you could think of it as like communication inflation. It's the same principles as, like, if you drop a new NFT every time you want to communicate something new, eventually you just like, you inflate the supply of or canvases so exponentially that maybe you lose attention that way. I don't know. It have to be something that you test. I think a lot of people are way too cautious on supply. That's a whole nother conversation. But like, demand is obviously way more important than, like, figuring out demand is way more important than supply. And a lot of artists getting into this space go, the one of one direction, and they're told by people to limit the work they put out there. And that, again, is a long conversation, but that kind of runs like that. That's the antithesis of how I would approach building any kind of reputation on the internet, because that's basically runs completely counter to all of the things that the internet offers you.
You just like, one thing is, I think, using this living canvas and it being a distributed network, you've given so much back to the holder to be able to create their own narrative. Like, you've given them the capability to play a provenance. I hesitate to call it a game, but you've given them the capability to create a provenance experience. You've given them the capability to tune into metadata refreshes. And you've given them the capability to kind of evoke emotion on color banding and burning. And we haven't even talked about burning them down. So like, that's, that's almost like a whole nother topic. I'm curious your take on provenance kind of time warping. And I know this is a complex topic, but we've seen, as society's evolved, we've seen the time of provenance, the time something goes from zero to important, we've seen it shrink, where, a Van Gogh has to be around for 100 years in order to be a Van Gogh. Basquiat really was like one of the first like cultural phenomenons that hacked provenance, where he comes up in the 70s, and because of culture, it became, valuable quick. And we've seen CryptoPunks time warp provenance from 2017 to 2023. Like, you can't fade the provenance of a CryptoPunk. And one of my personal experiences, the first time I saw a CryptoPunk, I wasn't really into it. It didn't evoke emotion. 2023, it evokes emotion. Has to be, to some degree, provenance playing into that. So I feel, and I'm putting this on you, so apologies for that, but I feel like you've sped up some type of time warp on provenance, at least from my perspective as a subjective node. Would love to get your takes on like that thought process when it comes to provenance.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. I think the underlying change is connected consciousness. So this idea of Van Gogh's work taking 200 years to come to prominence as a function of, somebody in a museum looking under a microscope at where this paint came from and what year it was applied to this canvas and where he supposedly lived at the time, and cross-referencing all these eyewitness accounts and all that stuff. It's like, obviously that's just like the level of quality and craft that goes into that work. It definitely puts it in that category, but it doesn't make it inevitable in the same way that the feedback from a network in real time seems to have done that. And I think that's what sped up. Like the Basquiat thing to me is like, if all of these things are networks, maybe, networks of museums kind of verify the provenance of a Monet or a Van Gogh, or like, and then Basquiat era is more probably like pop culture, celebrity, New York socialite, people of tastemakers, musicians, whoever, saying like, yeah, that's good, I want one. And obviously it is good and beautiful and amazingly well done. And now we're in this like hyper connected version of that, where a certain level of activation energy, and I think CryptoPunks is probably the best example of it to date, is like it just reaches this level where there's enough consensus around this thing being first or interesting or culturally significant, where you just can't go back past a certain amount. And I don't even know how to quantify that, but I wrote this thing a couple of weeks ago. Like I think Andy Warhol came up with 15 minutes of fame, that idea of like in the future everyone will have 15 minutes of fame. And I did a little pun on that, like everyone will have 15 blocks of fame. So like your level of prominence in the net, like everyone goes viral once, or like the amount of attention and energy that is focused on a node in the network. and then the whole network moves on. I think that has obviously been true of like our news cycles. Even they just shorten, where it's like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you'd be following a news story for a year or 2 years. Now it's like, I think I read a journalist writing about this, where it's like they spend 6 months on a story, they put it out, and a day later, nobody can even remember the story. But like when they started their career, that would be a career defining thing, right? To put this story out that, you know, this person covered X. Now it feels like that is much, much harder. It's not impossible to do, but it's much, much harder to do. And also feels like your earnings are compressed that way too. Like when you're, you know, in this moment where you make something that's resonating in culture, it's not the 30, 40, it can be, but it doesn't have to be the 30 or 40 year career with the gold watch at the end. It's your ability to capture a moment in time when that moment in time is happening. I think this is me talking about it, so this is not necessarily right. This like, it's what everybody thinks of it, but the check thing in particular feels like tapping into an idea that's already being thought about, right? It's like almost like you're like tapping into a reserve of oil. Like you hit oil and it just comes flying out of the ground because it's already, this idea is already out there. You just found a vehicle to channel all of this interest and attention into the thing. And that's like, then there's all these like mimetic waves that happen after that. Like punks came out, and then I think a few people got interested and did, like, I think the Bored Ape guys were inspired by punks, right? They cite them as reference, but so many fewer eyeballs on digital collectibles in 2017, was it? Punks were first created. The amount of time it took for that first iteration to come out, like that first notable iteration, was 3 years, and then after that it was 3 months, right? There's 10,000 PFP or hundreds of thousands of them because Bored Apes hit, and then everyone's way more familiar with the technology. Bang, the meme is like goes underground. And with checks, even there was stuff a day after. Like there were people that built what we were building before we even had a chance to build it. Like the way I described it, they're like, oh, I've done it with this, it's ducks or it's whatever else, it's done. But I had the distribution, and I've been telling the story for a couple months, which is another like nod to provenance. It's like everything about checks, someone else can clone. Anybody listening to this, you go download the art, download the contracts, deploy them, call them the same thing, do whatever you want with it. But this is now the discussion of provenance, is like, why would somebody want this one versus that one? And this is a whole nother probably podcast episode, but the idea of AI, like content generation in a second, like the craft of making the image is not necessarily the point of leverage that everybody thinks it is in art anymore, right? There's one example I've been going back to the last couple of weeks is David Guetta put this video on Instagram, I think. Don't know if you boys have seen this, but he's like, write me a techno song in the style of Eminem. So he goes into chat GPT or something, he gets these lyrics, then he goes over to another AI tool and he says, make me an MP3 of Eminem's voice saying this stuff, right? And obviously Eminem had nothing to do with that. He then takes the thing, plays it, like puts it in his set and plays this massive venue. And he's got a video, you should watch it, of him explaining the process. He replies to the tweet, he's like, I'm not going to commercialize this, obviously. And it's all those lines are so blurred. It's like you made a post about it, you played it at a venue, like it's so blurry. But what does that do? It's like referencing Eminem, who's obviously like a massive pillar of culture, and the value will go back to Eminem. Like people listening to an Eminem song at a David Guetta concert, it's like, oh, I'm going to go back and, you know, stream a bunch of Eminem. I'm going to go and buy an old Eminem album. Like one of the promises or one of the things that I'm most interested in about this world is like, it is like removing restrictions from like the flow of value. And there's just a lot of different converging technologies right now that make me want people to understand what provenance is. Like provenance is so important now because people can, like the execution thing is not really going to be a barrier in a few years. Like if you can have a great idea, you're probably going to be able to type a few sentences into GP. They're going to write the contract for you, make the art for you, do whatever else. The idea is going to be the point of like absolute, like that's going to be the thing that earns you leverage or attention or whatever else. So provenance is important. And obviously we're trying to really explore that idea and get people to think about that idea in everything we're doing with checks specifically.
That's fire. This is why we do this, Jack. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. 15 blocks of fame. Jack, it's a pleasure to have you on here. The other, big theme in the NFT space and Web3 that you're really helping to bring to life is the spirit of community. And, we put your art, not that we want to, box you in here, but we put your art in a category at Goodmonth Labs that we call bullish art. And if you're wondering what bullish art is, the hallmark of bullish art is that it inspires other artists, it inspires builders, other creators. And so we saw that here with our own Goodmonth ETH. And he dropped a hip hop track when he was inspired by visualized value checks. So we just kind of want to play that for you here. For our outro. So Hazy B, if you could drop that track for Jack.
So I recorded this when it was like a 0.1 floor on checks.
That's a bad bet. If the
So this is like,
this
is cool, man.
Back, flipping not cheap when that Jenny Duh hits. That's the race to 250 in the world, and you chose to sleep. That's a bad bet. If you wake up checkless, no more people without bags, yet they need status. Running head first with the VVChecks thirst. Never heard of a hearse, but they connecting the dots.
Yo, Jack's got takes. Jack's got takes for days. Good, man. How did that hit the mental right there, bro?
Flossed me, dude. He flossed my lobes. My cerebral just got completely cleansed, like a pick from the dentist in there with some orthopedic cleansing. Rinsed.
You look like a newborn baby. Newborn baby. You just fucking woke up, dude. What just happened here?
He hit on some serious topics. It was amazing. It was like the thing that really like broke through there with his example of using AI for the EDM track and Eminem and using distribution through the DJ made me realize, like, I had this breakthrough for the first moment that, we talked provenance. Provenance kind of belongs to the creator, but the fact that executing isn't that hard these days with AI, the distribution and the participation, it kind of like had a breakthrough for the first time that like actually holding an NFT that's a part of something viral, like as a participant is valuable. It matters. Like you as a participant to making it valuable, to making it viral, to allowing its provenance to mean something gives you a note of, what he called economic energy throughout the middle of that podcast. And it was absolute fire. I think it is an amazing brain. His project is great, but I think he's just like, he's goated. He's officially in the no fade zone.
No question about it. Jack Butcher is in the no fade zone. There's just, 1 hour is not enough time. You know what I'm saying? Like the reality is that conversation could have gone on for days. So we probably are going to need to reach out to him and run that back at some point. Mitch, we got you back in the studio here. How are you feeling on the outro of this Jack Butcher experience we just had, my friend?
No, it was super cool. I mean, like, I was thinking about, because I mentioned the visualized value extension, right, that I see when I open my Chrome. And that really kind of is what the editions are now, right? It's pay 2+ ETH to get a direct line into the mind of Jack. And I'm glad I minted that. I'm getting in right now, but I mean, I think you guys can agree, and our listeners and viewers will agree, like, definitely don't fade this guy. It's still early in 2023, and I think there's a long road for this to play out on.
How about the thought process on the Super Bowl? Like, I mean, the fact that dude was thinking like in 3 years, people will be able to recall when the burn happened because of the mimetic effect of the Super Bowl, at least in America. What the fuck, man? That is brilliant. That's his background in advertising.
All of us silly traders were sitting here like, I mean, that's what you and I were sitting there on the day. We're like, he fucked up. He shouldn't have tried to go against the Super Bowl. Everybody's selling. We're like, should we exit? He lost.
We're gonna have to cut that.
No, dude, this is gold. It was the weakest I've been. I was sitting there with. I remember where I was. I was like, should we puke this 32 right now? Good.
Yeah, that didn't even come out. That didn't even come out that we hold checks 32. Like our brains were getting licked by intellectual just God mode that we weren't even we didn't even bag pump.
What else is there to say? If you've been tuning into the Never Fade podcast, hopefully you've been enjoying this content as much as we've been enjoying creating it. Follow me at FaXx_ETH on Twitter. Follow at Goodmonth ETH and at OX1M2M3 Mitch Morales. Thanks for joining us again, my friend. This is another episode of Never Fade, the NFT podcast. To our producer Hazy B, roll us out with that Jack Butcher track, man. That was a lot of fun.
You get to catch me without a roof over my head, verifying everything. That's a bad bet if the bags check less. About to burn back to back, flipping not cheap when that Jenny Duh hits. That's the race to 250 in the world, and you chose to sleep. That's a bad bet if you wake up check less. No more people without bags, yet they need status. Running head first with the VVChecks Editions. Never heard of a hearse, but they connecting the dots.